And if anyone during the course of the webinar has any questions, please feel free to add those into the chat. And we will get to those as we're able, or at the end of the webinar, we'll have a chance to answer questions as well that you may have through the course of the webinar. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Welcome to our Juvenile Justice Advocates International webinar on assessing and certifying places of child detention. This webinar is a follow-up webinar to one that we held at the end of 2023 for the publication of our International Detention Standards publication. And so we'll be going over that a little bit and sharing with folks the link for that. But the assessing and certifying that we'll be going through today is based on those standards. So the standards that are available on our website, and I think I have the link here as well. So if people want to check that, I can also drop the link into the chat. So that people have a chance to download the standards if they haven't had a chance to already. My name is Douglas Keeler. I am the Director of Juvenile Justice Advocates International. Today also with us is Certifying Garcia. She is our National Director in Mexico. Drop this in the chat for folks. There's the link in the chat to be able to download the International Standards publication. First, a little bit about our organization. If you're not familiar with us, Juvenile Justice Advocates International, our mission as an organization is actually to, on the wrong way in the PowerPoint, to protect the rights of children who are in conflict with the law and minimize the deprivation of liberty. Our projects seek to ensure that the deprivation of liberty for children is used only as a last resort and for the shortest period of time possible. The vast majority of our work takes place in the Western Hemisphere, in Mexico, in the United States, and we've had some projects also in other parts of Central America, and where we work with local authorities to reduce the use of incarceration, improve detention conditions for children who are in conflict with the law. So this webinar, like I said, is part of a series on our detention monitoring and detention standards related to improving conditions of detention for youth who are incarcerated, whether it's during their legal process, pretrial detention, or post conviction sentencing to places of incarceration. When we talk about reviewing and evaluating and assessing places of detention, I think it's a well-known that places of detention need to have oversight, need to have supervision, need to be reviewed by outside actors. And there's two basic types of review of oversight of places of detention. There's the reactive oversight that's focused mainly on responding to incidences once they've occurred. So you think of your Human Rights Commission or Human Rights Ombudsman, whether there's complaint mechanisms, internal complaint mechanisms within the facilities, as well as response to internal responses by the authorities who are in charge of those facilities. And then there's more proactive methods trying to improve facilities so that those types of human rights complaints and violations of children's rights don't occur in the first place. So there we look at internal management of the facility. Oftentimes jurisdictions, whether it's local jurisdictions or national jurisdictions, will have licensing requirements for those facilities. And then there's also external assessments and certifications. So with those reactive methods of evaluating and providing oversight to those facilities, they often can be prescribed by law, if there's an ombudsman that's required, or if there's a complaint mechanism. But it often can be also an adversarial, more of an adversarial environment, whereas theoretically a proactive approach are oftentimes can be more more collaborative. Now, obviously, that depends on kind of the response of the facility and kind of the relationships that they have. The specific method of oversight and facility assessment that we're looking at with this webinar and with the certification and assessments that our organization conducts with the standards is more based on a proactive external assessment approach. So these are with facilities that may or may not have had complaints with local human rights commissions or human rights ombudsman, but they have decided whether in conjunction with kind of our advocacy or other government officials or advocates that they would like to take a proactive approach to improving detention conditions and reducing the risk of human rights abuses in those facilities. And so this is all designed as a collaborative approach with the facilities, something that's taken on in conjunction with the authorities that are overseeing those facilities. So this discussion kind of takes place in that lower right quadrant of the chart here. There's really good guides on already existing guides on how to conduct visits to places of child incarceration, both by I mentioned in the chat of Penal Reform International's tools, which are excellent tools. There's also Defense for Children International, which also have really good tools, as well as UNICEF and other UN bodies talking about how to conduct site visits to facilities when you're acting as like an ombuds person or human rights mechanism, which is a little bit different than the intentions with this discussion today. So when we're talking about facility assessment, assessing places of child incarceration, and the facility has made a determination, the authorities have made a determination that they want to improve their facility, improve the conditions, reduce the risk of human rights abuses in those facilities. The tools that we are making available and that are used as part of the international standards have been designed to be used in one of two ways, and we've had experience using them in one of two ways, either through self-assessment. So when the local facility itself, the authorities who run that facility, make the decision to conduct self-assessment and run that self-assessment with their local teams. It can be in conjunction with us, or it can be completely independent as well. And then there's external assessment. So this would be an assessment where a group, this is where a group of our team, usually led by JJAI, would come in and conduct an external assessment of the facility. And there's different kind of mix and match ways that this can take place, but we'll talk kind of generally in these two categories, these two buckets of the types of assessments. Was this where you were going to take over, or is it the next slide? All right, great. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to JJAI Garcia, who has led both some of our self-assessments as well as our external assessments, and she may want to also give you a little bit more background on some of her experiences providing the technical assistance and leading those assessment teams. But go ahead, JJAI.
Thank you, Douglas, and good morning, everybody. Just to close up this part of the presentation, this slide, when doing an external assessment, I believe facilities probably have an expectation of time when it comes to concluding the whole assessment process, which can be a little bit longer since we're working with an external team whose time it's not dependent on the activities of the facility. So even though we don't have a set time, we have a proposed time when doing an assessment. That's usually a question. It is obvious that the self-assessment could be a bit more fast-paced than the external assessment. And that's the only thing that I wanted to add on this section. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so this is the process. How do we how do we help facilities to assess themselves? How do we come in and provide that service to them? We first have to start with a group, a team, a group of people that can be experts in the different areas that the standards provide guidance to facilities. And I'll talk a bit more about that team. This team does an initial assessment with a very peculiar methodology and steps, and with different, looking at all the sources of information in the facility so that the team can find um, on point areas of opportunity for the facility, and we can provide um, more assistance to facilities. From this initial assessment, we'll have an improvement plan, or what we call a corrective plan as well, where all the findings from the initial assessment will be set to be addressed alongside the facility. When this is an external assessment, then the JJAI, or sometimes even the assessment team, will walk alongside the facility to take to work on all the improvement plans through this corrective action. Um, so that this is a time of more hand on hand technical assessment. And then we have a final assessment, and depending on the results, we can have a certification. If we go to the next slide, we see kind of like the same information, but I'll just give some examples of this. So what can I say about the assessment team? We typically recommend that the assessment team is made up of people who have not previously worked in the penitentiary system, because their point of view, or the bar, the bar of what's the accepted bar of practices when it comes to children. We want that to be similar to what we find in the community around the facility, um, and closer to best practices. When talking about a self-assessment, that could be a little bit more challenging. So what we can provide to a facility is guidance in making up this team. What we really want is someone with a fresh eye, someone who will bring the community standard of being when it comes to children's rights to the facility. And this team can be from 5 to maybe even 10 people. This will all depend on their schedule, their availability. The team members have to reflect the areas of the standards. So we ideally would need a doctor or a psychologist, or a medical practitioner. We can also have a human rights advocate, a human children rights advocate. We can have other lawyers or social workers. Could be a teacher. All these areas that have to do with the daily programming for children. We want that expertise to be reflected in the team members. The initial assessment, something additional that I can mention to this is, for both the self-assessment and the external assessment from JJI, we will provide training. We can provide training onto how to assess, how to go through the standards, look at the sources of information, and determine compliance with standards. The improvement plan, its length will depend on the initial assessment results. So if this is a facility that um, it's already running with good practices, and we find that it's just a little tweak here and there. So we've had some examples of this. We've assessed facilities with good practices already, but maybe these practices are not reflected in written protocols, or in the general facility policies. So for that kind of of facilities, maybe the improvement plan could be quite short, where JJI and the assessment team are helping put together these protocols of already existing good practices. Sometimes the improvement plan can be quite long, depending probably maybe even with on infrastructure. Let's just say the facility does not have proper accommodation for children in the school area or even in their bedrooms, then that improvement plan could be a little more lengthy, because we understand it depends on the facility and the institution budget and all of those steps that need to be followed in those cases. Or we can find other challenging situations. Maybe there are some, this could happen. We can find some first level corruption at times, and the improvement plan could will have to be very hand in hand with the facility, because whatever the facility decides on how to deal with those things, it needs to be followed up with proper training and um, proper yeah, just training to staff, and the follow up on how do they implement those new practices. Um, so we've had improvement plans that can go from 6 months to maybe a whole year. I believe the longest one we've had has been a year, and the facility was able to um, assess all the areas, all the steps in the corrective plan. I already talked a little about the corrective actions. The final assessment, it's very similar to the initial assessment, but focusing on those areas that the facility was not able to fully comply, which makes it a bit more easy and quicker in time. Um, and if we go to the next step, I can talk about the next slide, sorry, I can talk about the certification. So when can we say, or why do we say there's a certification? So what we're trying to accomplish with this standards and this assessment exercise is not only to properly and more efficiently find those areas that facilities need to be focusing in order to meet international standards of good practices in the administration of justice when it comes to children, but also so that it's a seal of confidence in a way when we have a facility that can comply with this standards. Then we can say a facility is truly specialized in children and youth, and they implement practices for the youth system as opposed to maybe imitating practices from the adult system. Um, so the requirements for this, we have 570 standards spread out of different areas that some of you already know. And you can download the tool. I believe that link is in the chat box. And these standards uh, we have three types of standards, what we call priority one, priority two, and priority three. The first ones are related to the security and integrity of children directly. So we can say in a way that these are like the non-negotiable standards. It will be imperative for a facility to comply with all the priority one standards in order to be certified. And the standards are about a fourth of the entirety of the tool. We have the priority two. These are legally required, maybe by international law or national law, depending on the jurisdiction that we're working on. And the facility must meet 75% of those standards. These standards are about half of the entire tool. And then we have the priority three standards. With these are higher level desired good practices, but they're not related directly to the security and integrity of youth, or it's not an already required standard by national statutes. And the facility must meet 50% of this kind of standard. So if in a facility after the assessment they have 100% compliance in priority 1, at least 75% compliance on standards priority 2, and 50% compliance on standards priority 3, then we can say this is a fully well assessed and certified facility specialized in youth, in children. Can we go to the next slide? So what are the next steps if you are in this meeting today, if you participated, you attended our webinar last November? You can download the standards, get familiar with them if you have not. What can a facility do if they're on they want to assess their facility of, or if any jurisdiction is ready for an assessment, they need to then adapt the standards to the national law, which means we can have even the punitive age changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or sometimes some governments may have some standards related to the length of stay in a facility. So that needs to be adapted to each country, and that's a whole process. You can choose a virtual or on-site training, and we can have further meetings to talk about what would this imply. Then JJAI will be providing technical assistance if it's an on-site, and technical assistance virtually if it's an independent assessment. And finally, if all the requirements for certification are met, then we can provide the certification for the facility. I believe this is the last slide, Douglas. I don't know. I mean, we only have very few people in this meeting. I don't know if we want to open this to a quick Q&A. Or
yeah, thank you, Sarai. If people have questions, please go ahead and take the time to ask questions. I'd also just like to add, people have asked, why provide a certification has been a question out there. So we've been doing work with these standards in both the United States and in Mexico for probably 7 or 8 years now at this point. And that what we've seen is that facilities, when it's a voluntary process, some facilities are interested in participating, but that it's a significant amount of work to conduct this type of assessment. As you see, there's a lot of standards, there's a lot of requirements, and it's a fairly, like we said during the last webinar, it's the most thorough kind of audit tool available for facilities or for places of child incarceration. And so we've also have done some surveys with facilities and found that without kind of additional incentives for those facilities to participate, and specifically without kind of a grade or certification, that it's very hard to get facilities to participate in these activities. And also that there are we've seen other certifications or accreditations come into the youth detention space, where the standards are not as rigorous, where the standards are not as high, and facilities that really, in our opinion, have kind of no business being accredited or certified, being held up as exemplary facilities. And so we wanted to give facilities and governments another option to look at for assessing their facilities and determining really what's kind of going on in those facilities and what really needs to change in those facilities in a rigorous way, but then also kind of the demand for that certification at the end of that process. And so that's kind of the reason that our organization has decided to take this step to begin certifying facilities that meet these rigorous standards and that have taken the time and made the investment in their facilities to rise to those levels that Sarai described between the priority 1s, priority 2s, and priority 3 level standards. We'd like to see every facility adopt every action that's recommended in the standards. We know that that's not always realistic, and there's obviously resource constraints, et cetera. But as we noted in the last webinar in November, the vast majority of the standards are based on policies and procedures taking place in the facility. Of course, there are standards about the facility infrastructure, but because our work is so diverse between jurisdictions and countries and localities that have resources versus localities that are very stretched when it comes to resources in their juvenile justice systems, the standards are really focused. The balance of focus is on policies and procedures that take place where the resource requirements are not as great. It will always take resources to ensure that children are protected when they're in places of detention or places of incarceration. It's not something that you can do kind of cut corners and do cheap. But at the same time, living in the real world, we are very familiar with the resource constraints on authorities in the juvenile justice system. So our goal as an organization is to see places of incarceration first and foremost be the last resort, but second, for the youth, for the children who are in those facilities, that they are safe and that they are getting the services that they need and are able to reintegrate successfully back into society. And we believe that this is one possible way that these facilities can, a possible path that they can take towards that end. So with that, if there aren't, I don't know if there are any other final comments that you had today from your experiences in leading these teams and conducting these assessments.
Well, the last thing that I can mention is sometimes we find local practitioners being interested in the assessment, and they probably need more information so that they can come to the institution and ensure the importance of this exercise. If that is the case, we can provide any kind of information on successes and good results from the assessment. Um, and yes, just any other, it may seem like a huge task, but once looking at the timings and then the resources when doing an assessment, it can be a quite rewarding process for the facility. We've also had that kind of feedback from facilities. It helps them put things into a different perspective when it comes to assistant children in detention. And I think that will be the last thing I would say.
Well, we appreciate everyone taking the time today to join the webinar. Like I said, we'll be posting both this and the November webinar to our website and to our YouTube channel, and anyone who's participated or signed up will send out the link for you. But we're very grateful for everyone's time, and have a wonderful Tuesday, everybody. Thank you.